Why is cultural heritage so often targeted during armed conflicts? What can be done to protect it and hold those who don't accountable for their actions? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Heghnar Watenpaugh. Heghnar Zeitlian Watenpaugh is professor of art history at the University of California, Davis. Her most recent book, The Missing Pages, The Modern Life of a Medieval Manuscript from Genocide to Justice, published in 2019, is the only book to win awards from both the Society for Armenian Studies and the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. Watenpaugh's writing has additionally featured in a BBC series about cultural heritage destroyed during the Syrian conflict. This year, she's a fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation, as well as a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. Professor Heghnar Watenpaugh, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you so much for having me, Mouin.
We tend to think of armed conflict in terms of territorial conquest, regime change, refugee flows, and the like. Yet attacks on cultural heritage are often also an intrinsic part of warfare. So perhaps we can start with the question, what constitutes cultural heritage? Does it exist in the eye of the beholder, or is there a more generally accepted definition of what it constitutes?
Thank you, Mouin. The UN, the United Nations, defines cultural heritage as both a product and a process. So cultural heritage is different from culture in general or from artworks or architecture. In considering both product and process, the idea is that cultural heritage is a resource from the past, say an ancient building or an ancient object or even an ancient intangible practice like a song or a way of cooking something. The idea is to present that element or object from the past to contemporaries in the present and also to preserve it for the future. So we're talking about a complex, when we talk about cultural heritage, we're talking about a field that involves many different kinds of knowledge. Art history is one of them, also engineering, tourism management, politics, policy, urban planning, but it involves different kinds of people engaged in a number of different activities, from economic to education to curating. So it's a very complex and dynamic field. And as you pointed out, in recent years, especially in the part of the world that you and I are interested in, there have been many very dramatic instances of the intentional destruction of cultural heritage. Of course, cultural heritage is always a non-renewable resource that is vulnerable to decay, the wear and tear of time, to climate pressures. But when cultural heritage is intentionally destroyed as part of warfare or as part of targeted persecution of certain groups, it has a very different kind of resonance. In the modern period, especially since the Second World War, since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, the cultural rights of various kinds have been part of the discussion and have been advocated for in various kinds of ways. Though traditionally cultural rights were seen as more of a luxury as opposed to more fundamental rights like the right to life or the right to health and so on. So part of the work of cultural rights activists has been to show that cultural rights are part of an interconnected networks of various kinds of rights. And,
so they complement the more, what you called, referred to as the more fundamental rights.
They are part of, they are connected in various kinds of ways. An attack on cultural heritage could also impact the economic rights of people who work, say, in the tourism industry or the cultural industry. And of course, in the case of the intentional destruction of cultural heritage, assaults on heritage are often part of a spectrum of violence that include other kinds of assaults on human dignity and human rights, including, killings and theft and so on.
But and as you noted, in the Middle East, there's been a real increase in such attacks in recent decades. Why is cultural heritage so often targeted during armed conflict? Is it what's referred to as collateral damage? Is it a more deliberate attack? Is it, a bit of both?
Those are two possible options, two possible things that can happen to cultural heritage during warfare. If there's, bombing or the kinds of combat, urban combat that we've seen in Syria, for example, urban neighborhoods or monuments can be destroyed, maybe not without being intentionally targeted. But more often than not, we've seen that cultural assets, whether listed or unlisted, are being intentionally targeted as a strategy of war. I've argued
just to clarify. So does it listed meaning listed as cultural heritage by UNESCO?
Yes, by UNESCO or by state entities, local
Right.
state entities. Yes, thank you for clarifying. See, I'm trying to get out of the technical jargon, so it's very helpful to remind me to be cautious about that. I've argued, and many others have argued too, that in warfare, assaults on culture are often not incidental, but rather are quite central. And they're very effective in bringing down morale. They also can cause serious economic hardship, especially for cultural heritage sites that are high value for tourism or are highly symbolic for the religious values of the targeted community, or are part of urban neighborhoods, what the Syrian architect Ammar Azzouz calls domicide, about the destruction of entire neighborhoods in Homs during the Syrian civil war.
And what are the main features of such campaigns? If we, let's say, focus on campaigns that consciously and deliberately target cultural heritage?
There is now, unfortunately, quite a literature on this subject. And one great place to begin is the report by Karima Benoun, who was at the time, until recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Heritage for the UN Human Rights Council. A couple of years ago, she wrote, I think, a very important report that defines the intentional destruction of culture in a legal sense and places it in the context of international human rights law, and argues the various ways in which assaults on cultural heritage of various kinds are assaults on human rights. This can, I'll give you a couple of examples. When we think of Mali, for example, the targeting of the mausolea of Sufi leaders by the militant group in Mali, that was very targeted attack on a very specific building. In the case of the Syrian civil war, we have had, as part of, urban warfare, the destruction of large parts of cities like Aleppo, like Homs, and so on.
Armenia, Palestine, Bosnia, and more recently, Iraq, Syria, and Nagorno-Karabakh are prominent examples where there have been campaigns to systematically eradicate cultural heritage. Are such campaigns conducted primarily out of political, religious, or commercial motivations, or do these motives tend to coalesce and mutually reinforce each other?
I'm sure motivations can always be quite complex. In the cases that you mentioned, these are examples of intentional destruction
Yes.
of cultural heritage during a conflict that has a strong intercommunal or ethnic character. I think it's fair to say, maybe not in all the examples. But in these examples, the intentional destruction of cultural heritage becomes part of a repertoire of assaults and ways to deprive your opponent of their rights, but also of things that they value. So if you attack a medical building, for example, as we've seen so often in the Syrian war, we're also seeing it currently in the war in Ukraine, that is, of course, a way of depriving your opponent of access to healthcare. It's devastating and, of course, unlawful under international law. So the destruction of cultural heritage of your opponent, and especially of highly symbolic, highly beloved structures, and these can include religious structures very often. The prominent cultural monuments of a community are its religious monuments that can create additional pain for your opponent, if you will. So cultural heritage has become very politicized, and as such, it has become a weapon of war that is being deployed in various contexts. It is part of a repertoire of assaults and on assaults on human dignity, and on the repertoire of inflicting various kinds of damage. So I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is that it would not be accurate to look at assaults on cultural heritage as being independent of other kinds of assaults. It's always part of a broader strategy of war or of demoralizing your enemy or of persecuting a group.
Well, I'm starting to think of two separate examples. Let's say on the one hand, you have cases like mosques in Bosnia or churches in Nagorno-Karabakh, where these are kind of living specimens, if you will, of cultural heritage of the people that are being targeted. But then if you go to places like Palmyra in Syria, or let's say the Sumerian or Babylonian ruins in Iraq, you're really looking, let's say, at cultural artifacts that no longer represent the religions of the people that live there, and perhaps can be seen more as part of a cumulative national heritage. So do you see, for example, that in one case it's more about destruction and the other it's more about looting for commercial motives, or is there not a clear distinction between these two types?
Every act of intentional destruction has a unique history and a unique trajectory and unique effects on the local community and on the international community. And every type of cultural heritage is different and seen differently. I'll take the example of Palmyra. Yes, the religion practiced at Palmyra in ancient times is no longer practiced by any living community that I'm aware of. But the local community in the city of Tadmor is very closely connected to the ruins of Palmyra, not only because they used to live in the middle, in the ruins before their habitations were removed in the process of preserving that site over the course of the 20th century. But the ruins of Palmyra are part of the livelihood of the inhabitants of Tadmor. They are part of their daily landscape. There's a very strong identification between the local community and the ruins of Palmyra. And of course, members of the Syrian community were the archaeologists and caretakers of the site, including, of course, the archaeologist who was murdered by ISIS while he was performing his duties. So, the local community is very implicated in Palmyra. But in the case of Palmyra, because it is part of a particular period of history of our part of the world that is very valorized as being part of the ancient world. It is also, Palmyra has always been part of this very international sense of what Western or European heritage is. So that adds, that's one of the reasons why when Palmyra was under attack and where parts of Palmyra were destroyed by ISIS, so-called Islamic State in 2015, there was an international outcry. Because the Palmyra, being an ancient site connected to Greco-Roman civilization, was so important to Western view of history and cultural heritage, even though for the Syrians, for the local community, Palmyra has never stopped being an important site. And in fact, the temple, they lived there, and the Temple of Bel spent several centuries being a mosque before it was preserved as a project that was begun under the French mandate, but continued by the independent Syrian state. So here in a site like Palmyra, you have a lot of very different dynamics at play. But as the Syrian archaeologist Salam al-Quntar has said, even this international recognition of Palmyra, the international outcry, ultimately did not save Palmyra from the fate that it encountered. And people like Salam al-Quntar, Brian Daniels, and many other archaeologists have long pointed out that the current system of international cultural heritage has really broken down. It has many shortcomings and inequities, and we really need to rethink the way in which not only states, but the international community as well, and international structures like UNESCO and others, intergovernmental structures, can really think of concrete ways to uphold this ideal of international cultural heritage that is universally accepted. The idea of world heritage, which maintains that every great achievement of human civilization belongs not only to the community that has an affinity to that heritage, but to all of us. So if that beautiful ideal is really going to be implemented, then UNESCO and other organizations really need to have some teeth in statements of concern, statements of outrage. Declarations have not helped people on the ground. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was going to say that takes me to my next question, and we've already talked about this a little bit, but the protection of cultural heritage is a relative latecomer to international law and the laws of war. You've just indicated as much yourself. So my question is, to what extent is it today specifically protected, beyond statements of concern and outrage? And how is it protected?
In short, in our current international system, it is states that are primarily responsible for protecting the heritage that exists on their territory. So, and the United Nations, of course, its membership are states. So, and this works very well if a state is doing a good job of protecting the cultural heritage that is on its territory. But what if a state is unable to protect cultural heritage because it is in disarray, or because it doesn't have the financial resources, or when the state itself is participating or facilitating the plundering or destruction of cultural heritage on its territory. When that case happens, then it is very, very difficult for UNESCO or other international organizations to even be able to gather facts about this. I mean, one of the things that we saw happening during the Syrian civil war is that because the Syrian state has not really allowed international experts to come and examine cultural heritage sites that have been attacked or looted. It is local activists who have taken on the burden of gathering facts and reporting, often with grainy cell phone videos. So, I mean, these are the kinds of people that we call cultural heritage defenders. Everyday people. They can be everyday people, or they can be specialists who have taken on as citizens they feel the need to gather facts and to transmit those facts to others, to bear witness. And it is certainly the case that if a state does not want scrutiny, they do not have to, they are not obligated to allow UNESCO to come in. That has been the position of Azerbaijan. It has declined to allow UNESCO to come in for a fact-finding mission to Nagorno-Karabakh and surrounding areas after the conclusion of the war in 2020, even though UNESCO has made formal demands several times in fairly strong language. It is within a state's purview to say yes or no.
So no universal jurisdiction, if you will, for
well, that's there. This is a question. Some people are now arguing that R2P, the international lawyer Sheila Pailan, for example, has argued that R2P should also apply
to the responsibility to protect.
The responsibility to protect should also apply to cultural heritage that is being destroyed in real time. I mean, these are really interesting discussions that have a legal element, but they also are part of public discussions that touch on all kinds of other subjects. So the legal element is important, but there are other areas that are important as well. Public debate, a sense of history, the interests of local groups, the economy, and so on.
And if we were to look concretely at what mechanisms currently exist to hold those who plan or conduct attacks on such heritage accountable, is this also similar to what you've just indicated, a responsibility that's allotted exclusively to states?
Yes, in short, yes. And this is an area where a lot of cultural heritage activists and human rights activists are it's a source of great frustration and a sense of the terrible limits to what one can do if a state is intransigent. Then there's very little.
Marbles.
Yes, then there's very little the international community can do. And so this places persecuted groups, minority communities, indigenous communities in a very difficult position, where by virtue of the way in which the international system is laid out with the primacy of states, these kinds of groups are at a disadvantage.
If we take one concrete example that's now come to mind, Iraq, you had a situation in which the US invasion and occupation for Iraq created the conditions for the massive looting and illicit sale of artifacts of Iraqi cultural heritage, quite a number of which ended up in private collections in the United States. And subsequently, the US government did go after some of those responsible for this looting and hoarding, and I believe arranged for some of them, some of these artifacts to be returned to Iraq, but others didn't really consider them sufficiently important or I mean, so this again shows, as you were indicating, that it's really under international law seems to be an almost exclusively state responsibility, but not only of the state on which that heritage is located.
Right. Well, in the case of Iraq, obviously, ostensibly Iraq is the state in question, but when you are under occupation or in disarray for a variety of reasons, if you are, a failed state or a corrupt state, then these kinds of attacks on cultural heritage can happen. Your example is also very helpful in thinking about how interconnected webs of bad behavior surrounding cultural heritage exist. So when somebody loots an archaeological site or a museum in Iraq, that they or through intermediaries connect with broader networks of people, from looters to intermediaries to art dealers to very respectable museums. And
I'm sorry, I believe it was the Hobby Lobby that had a
the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., whose collection comes primarily from the Green family collection of primarily biblical or Bible adjacent artifacts collected by the Green family, who are the owners of the Hobby Lobby stores. There have been several cases where the Museum of the Bible has had to return artifacts that have been discovered to have been looted in recent memory from Iraq, but also Greece. But they're not the Museum of the Bible is not the only one implicated in these things. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the most prominent museum in the United States, had purchased a glorious gold coffin of an ancient Egyptian sovereign in 2017. 2017 is not very long ago. And through the efforts of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, evidence was gathered that this coffin, this work of art, but it's also a dead person, right? Was looted from Egypt around 2011 during a period of breakdown of order that
during the uprising,
during the Arab Spring, and so ultimately that object was returned to Egypt. So that's a huge, incredible success story, and that's great. But for every object that is restituted, where it is possible to gather evidence, where it is possible to make a case, there are countless other objects that maybe are less prominent or go under the radar or are never discovered.
I was going to say there's a huge difference between, let's say, the coffin you just mentioned that's presumably on public display in a museum versus the many more artifacts that end up in private collections,
yes,
and people would never know about.
Indeed, the private collections are where the law protects such individuals, such collections. So it's very, very difficult. So all the restitutions that we see, all the positive news that we hear are only a fraction of the works of art and archaeological materials that disappear without a trace.
Turning now again to international law and international protection for cultural heritage, which you've already discussed quite a bit. I'd like to turn to a specific case you've written about, and this is the case that Armenia has brought against Azerbaijan before the International Court of Justice, and I think you've described this as a test case for the protection of cultural heritage. What are the main elements of this case? And if you look at how this case has been developing, do you see room for optimism, not only for the plaintiffs, so to speak, but also more generally?
So this is a really interesting case, and we're still at the beginning, and I'm very cautiously optimistic, but I think some principles are being established here that may resonate in the international cultural heritage sphere because they apply to many different cases. So to summarize very quickly, the Republic of Armenia brought a case against the Republic of Azerbaijan before the International Court of Justice, which is, of course, the judicial body of the United Nations. It's the court where states can sue each other if other forms of negotiations break down. And the ICJ is interesting because it accepts very few cases. Their jurisdiction is extremely circumscribed. But so they have taken this case, and this was followed by...
Of itself.
That's an achievement in of itself. Of course, they can dismiss it later, but for now, and within a week or 2 weeks of Armenia's filing, Azerbaijan filed a mirror case against the Republic of Armenia. So the two cases fall under they allege violations of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, CERD. So this convention is a very important convention historically, and both states are party to that. So to sort of simplify things, the various allegations, the lawsuit alleges a certain number of violations of CERD. So all the bad actions described have to be due to racial hatred. So right. It's the way in which the lawsuit
it's not only
has
the action,
to be,
but the intent behind it.
Yes, yes. So it has to be, evidence has to be presented to show that, say, holding of prisoners of war is because of racial hatred. And the two cases concern a number of different issues, including prisoners of war, but both cases also include allegations of violation of destruction of cultural heritage because of CERD as a product of racial hatred. So this is very, very important because if the court agrees with this assessment, it would provide a way to take action in the international realm in order to protect cultural heritage.
That would be an important precedent.
It would be a very important precedent. So we're very far from that, but so far the court has examined the preliminary evidence presented to them. There were several rounds of oral arguments where cultural heritage played a huge role. And both republics had a chance to present their arguments, and the ICJ indicated provisional measures ordering Azerbaijan to protect Armenian cultural heritage in the areas that have come under Azerbaijani jurisdiction as a result of the 2020 war. So that's huge. The International Court of Justice ordering a state to protect cultural heritage under its control. So for people who are interested in international law and cultural heritage, this is a case to watch. And there have been some very interesting discussions of this already. So we will see what happens. It will take years for the case to be examined on its merits at the court. And it is also a question whether Azerbaijan will obey the provisional measure indicated by the court. There have been some signs that it is defying that order. So I think it's very difficult to be completely optimistic, but with the ICJ litigation, a completely new avenue has been opened for the protection of cultural heritage internationally, especially in cases where the state responsible for the protection of that heritage has been recalcitrant or is party to the destruction of that heritage. So it could have a lot of implications.
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, the mere fact that the International Court of Justice has agreed to hear this case, and secondly, by its basically cease and desist order to the Republic of Azerbaijan, even if that is violated in practice, I think there are also cases of other ICJ opinions against the South African occupation of Namibia, the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara, and so on, where basically these were disrespected in practice, but set an important precedent in terms of how the international community began viewing these issues.
Most definitely.
So finally, I'd like to turn to your most recent award-winning book, The Missing Pages. In this book, you also examine the role specialists and institutions play in both the protection and assault on cultural heritage. And we've, I think, spoken a little bit about Mali and Palmyra in this respect. So can you elaborate on how, let's call them non-state actors, fit into this larger picture? And maybe if you take a moment perhaps to share with us, you know, the main theme of your book.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Maureen. So the book, The Missing Pages, was sort of an experiment in writing the history of an object. In this case, it was a medieval Armenian religious manuscript. As that object goes through the Armenian genocide and the aftermath of the genocide, along with the people that, you know, venerate it as a religious object and others who see it as a work of art. So it was an attempt to trace the life of an object and the various webs of social relationships that bind a particularly beautiful and holy object to the communities that, and the specific individuals and the communities that interact with it. And so what happened to this object very briefly is that it was removed from the church where it was a liturgical object as a result of the Armenian genocide. It passed from hand to hand, ended up in the United States, and was purchased by the Getty Museum in Los Angeles in 1994, where it remains. There was the Armenian Church instituted a lawsuit against the Getty for this over the ownership of this object, that after a number of years of discussion, negotiation, the lawsuit settled. And the fragment of this manuscript remains in Los Angeles at the Getty, and the rest of the manuscript is today in the Republic of Armenia. So what I wanted to do through the story of this object was to learn more about the various kinds of people who had a role in preserving it, even if it was by stealing it. And so and so it's not only the stories of art historians or religious scholars who have an interest in manuscripts, but also ordinary people from whom a sacred object like this can be a source of blessing, a source of power, but also scary, because such sacred objects have the power to punish enemies. So it was an attempt to try to understand the various ways in which objects can have agency in the world and are seen in different ways. So the Zaytun Gospels, this particular medieval object, was at a certain point in its life a sacred object, a liturgical object, a devotional object. But today, one of its roles is as an art object. And so I wanted to understand and tell the story of how these various episodes in the life of an object unfold. While I was researching this, I also learned more about the international networks of buyers and sellers, and that contribute to creating an international market for art objects with painful pasts, similar to the objects from Iraq and Egypt we discussed earlier. And there are many different kinds of actors in these networks. Many of them are perfectly legitimate and respectable, but many of them are far less so. But all of them are connected. And many people activists and art historians are very concerned now about the responsibility of museums, the importance of telling the truth about how certain objects have made their way to the museums today. And so what we call provenance in art history. And not every object that is in a museum today is there for an illegitimate or painful reason, but some of them are. And so the movement to compel museums to acknowledge these histories, their slogan is "Museums are not neutral." So that movement has made enormous headway in just the last 5 years. So during the time when I was writing the book, the conversation about these kinds of issues was changing dramatically, and I think continues to change.
I think in the last few years, it's been a particularly pertinent issue for European museums and African art.
Yes, yes, because it so clearly, especially in the case of the so-called Benin bronzes, the link between the acquisition of these objects and very violent episodes of colonialism is so clear. That's a very powerful story.
Ultimately,
the Smithsonian institution in the United States has announced recently that it will return several objects that are part of the Benin bronzes that they have in their possession. But some museums are...
they know better. Yeah. Well, and again, I think, whether we're talking about the missing pages or Mali or Palmyra, or these situations with looted Iraqi artifacts, I think you've helped us understand how the actions of individuals, whether for good or ill, can have been so prominent in driving the discussion about cultural heritage and its protection forward, to the extent that now we're seeing, let's cautiously call it, an expansion of international law to also take account of cultural rights and perhaps ultimately accountability for the violation of cultural heritage.
Absolutely. I just want to mention one thing. In all of these voices about cultural heritage, some have more authority and power to be heard than others. Part of my work as an art historian and an activist is to try to listen to the voices on the ground that are traditionally not heard. So I want to talk about a group in Aleppo, a group of local activists. They're called Asdiqa Bab al-Nasr. So they're a group of inhabitants of Aleppo who live around one of the old city gates called Bab al-Nasr. And they are a very small group. And a part of their goal is to bring together citizens of Aleppo from various backgrounds and to emphasize their connection to this ancient city with such a deep and layered architecture. And they've started with some very concrete activities like cleaning up the areas around Bab al-Nasser that was affected by the war, but also starting a conversation about thinking about Aleppo and its architectural heritage in the years of the war differently. So I just wish that these voices could be heard as loudly and listened to as attentively as some of the more authoritative voices that come out of The Hague or other places.
Well, you've certainly succeeded in making those voices more heard than they have previously. Professor Heghnar Watenpaugh, once again, I'd really like to thank you for taking the time to share your expertise and insights with Connections. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mouin.